Thanks, Christina. We haven't talked a lot about ratings today so far, apart from a helpful little plug from Richard about how lovely we are. To explain a little bit about how rating agencies think about extendable maturities, I think I probably need to say a tiny bit about ratings themselves. So what I've got here is a one-page summary of how Moody's rates cover bonds. This is distilled from roughly 50 pages of rating methodology, which I'm sure you're all desperate to go out and read now that you've heard about it. If you are sort of getting started in the world of covered bonds, ratings typically are a factor, and so having the methodology here in front of you I can give you some idea of where we come from, and particularly on the subject of extendables. So if you look at the top row, and I'm not going to talk in detail about methodology, obviously, because that's a very much longer discussion, but just to give some background, we are, at Moody's at least, we're rating to expected loss. And for covered bonds, that essentially consists of looking at the risk on the issuer, and then to what extent we can get additional value into the rating by looking at the cover pool. On the second line, what we're also doing is we do the first top line calculation is largely quantitative. It's based on modelling. On the second line, we have some linkage between the rating of the issuer and the rating of the covered bonds, and there's reasons for doing that, which basically are concerned with how much if you lose essentially the backing of the issuer, how much that sort of increases the overall risk on the covered bonds. And then right at the bottom, I've just noted we have country ceilings, which I think probably everyone gets the idea of. So how do extendable maturities fit into this picture? So they do fit in two ways, really, for us. The first one is the red circle here, just in the second row, around this thing called the TPI. And the TPI stands for Timely Payment Indicator. And that is it's essentially the risk that if the issuer fails, the covered bond will default. And where that's driven by a number of factors, but one of the factors that can drive that, and as I said, it's qualitative, so it's a bit of a balancing exercise. But one of the factors that can drive whether or not the covered bond defaults if the issuer fails is whether you can extend the covered bond. I think that probably makes sense. So that's one factor. So that's, theoretically at least, an extension can mean that we can essentially have less linkage between the issuer and the covered bonds. Then on the top line, on the right-hand side here, right down at the end, you'll see there's three boxes that's stacked on top of each other, and the middle one says refinancing risk. And Christina alluded to this, and just to say sort of a little bit more detail on that, this really drives partly how we see the value of the cover pool after the issuer defaults. And I think that's really important, thinking about things like triggers for extension. From a rating perspective, from rating the covered bonds in particular, an extension trigger that only takes effect while the issuer is solvent, a market disruption or whatever, that may be helpful, but that's not really going to do much for the covered bond rating. It's all about whether extensions can help after the issuer is not there, because the issuer has a primary obligation to pay on the covered bonds and is the first and foremost source of repayment for the covered bonds. So it's really after the issuer is not there or if the issuer is sort of struggling to the point where it needs to rely on the cover pool to repay the covered bonds. that's when we look at how much value we can get out of an extension. And one source of this value is to give more time to enable the cover pool to add value. Because the cover pool is liquid, it's typically largely comprised of mortgage loans, and those mortgage loans cannot be turned into cash overnight. Why would you want them to turn them into cash? Simply because the covered bonds will mature in almost all cases sooner than the assets themselves would naturally mature. So when I talk about extensions here, I'm talking about the typical extension, which is a 12-month soft bullet. A conditional pass-through, as Christina mentioned, is a lot more helpful when it comes to removing the risk of refinancing, because it essentially, after issuer default, forces the assets and liabilities to mature at the same rate. Okay, so those are the two factors. Firstly, we have refinancing risk is being reduced by the ability to extend. That's helping the quantitative analysis, reducing potential over-collateralization. And secondly, we potentially are allowing more of a delinkage between the issuer and the covered bonds. So I wanted to just drill down a little bit more into this idea of the asset liability mismatch. I think sometimes it's not really that, it's kind of, everyone knows it's there, but it's not really sort of very specifically delineated. So I took just a couple of charts from one of our performance overviews. These are charts for a Norwegian issuer, but it's really not relevant who the issuer is because they're very typical of large numbers of covered bond programs across Europe and elsewhere. And in the top chart, what you can see is the green line across the top shows how the assets will amortize from a particular point in time. This is a point where, you know, the T equals 0 is essentially at the failure of the bank. So the bank isn't doing anything else. And I listed here some of the assumptions. So the assumptions here include that there will be no more assets added to the cover pool because the bank is not going to do that. There will also be no more covered bonds issued. And we're also assuming here that we're only looking at principal payments and that we only have the over-collateralization levels that are sort of committed by law or by contract. So it's kind of a stressed amortization, but you can see that on the x-axis, you can see like a 9-year period, and on the y-axis, you can see the level of assets in the cover pool. So those assets, they actually amortize pretty slowly. They're 25-year mortgages. They're paying down slowly. Some of them won't even be amortizing, won't be amortizing principal. And then on the light blue, you can see that's the covered bonds amortizing, and they're going a lot quicker. And what you can see quite clearly is that the money you're getting from the assets is not enough to repay the covered bonds. And it's also what I should highlight also is if we're thinking about extendable maturities in this context, they really aren't a silver bullet if you're talking about the typical 12-month extension. If you look at 1 year into the process, you can see that you're really only at the early stages of this mismatch. So while a 1-year extension can improve the quantitative analysis of the covered bond, and while it can also give you time to try and avoid a default, it doesn't do everything for you. So there is still a need to understand that the refinancing process will need to involve more than just a 1-year maturity extension. And this is also highlighted in the bottom chart here, which is it's basically the cash flows on the net cash flows on the cover pool after we sort of start from T equals 0. So you've got principal payments coming in, and then you've got covered bond repayments going out. And as you can see, over time, the shortfall just increases because every time you repay a 1 billion euro covered bond, you end up with a massive shortfall in your cash flows. So it is actually after 5 years that you have the maximum mismatch. this is where in this case, 70% of the outstanding liabilities are not being met from incomings. So that really just serves to illustrate that if you move everything by a 1 year period, looking along the x-axis, that's going to help, but it's only going to help to some extent. But nevertheless, extendable maturities do help from a rating perspective. We do generally consider them to be a material benefit, and we only really consider them to be a material benefit if the extension occurs close to or at the point of or after the issuer is defaulted, because before that time, we really are just looking at the issuer themselves and the issuer's ratings as sort of representing the source of the credit benefit, if you like. So I'll stop there. And just on ratings generally, also, I think there's a few of us here from rating agencies, so please do come and ask if you've got additional questions on ratings.